Captain Vessic Thane had heard of the human broadcast policy long before he ever expected to hear it directed at his own ship, and he had never once believed it was anything more than diplomatic theater. It was, by the standards of every other galactic power he had encountered in 30 years of military service, a strange and faintly absurd practice. When a human vessel detected a hostile weapons lock against it, it did not simply respond in kind the way any reasonable navy would. It broadcast a warning, flat, unencrypted, transmitted across every frequency within range, audible to the targeting vessel and anyone else close enough to listen. Human warship locked on. Nothing more. No demand, no threat, no negotiation. Simply a fact, stated once, and then silence until whatever followed. Thane had discussed the policy with his own senior staff on more than one occasion, always with the same dismissive amusement. It is a courtesy extended by a species too young to understand the cost of extending it, he had told his weapons officer, some years earlier, during a routine briefing on human military doctrine. No serious power announces its intentions to an enemy before acting on them. I suspect it is theater, meant to appear principled and nothing more. I would wager any credible test of that policy reveals considerably more hesitation behind it than the broadcast lets on. He had never expected to be the one who tested it. His career, spanning 3 decades of service to the Kesh Deep Range Consortium's defense forces, had been built on a foundation of careful, calculated risk assessment, a reputation, hard-earned across a dozen border engagements against considerably less restrained powers, for reading an opponent's true capability accurately, regardless of whatever posturing surrounded it. It was that reputation, more than any specific tactical brilliance, that had elevated him to command of the consortium's most prestigious defense contingent, and it was that same reputation, he would later come to understand, that had made him particularly vulnerable to the specific kind of misjudgment that followed. He had studied human military doctrine extensively over the years, not out of any particular admiration for the species, but out of the same professional thoroughness he applied to every potential adversary his career might eventually bring him into contact with. He had read the broadcast policy's official justification, published openly by the human government for any interested party to review, a stated commitment to giving any targeted vessel a final, explicit opportunity to disengage before further action, rooted, according to the policy's own preamble, in a belief that unnecessary casualties served no one's genuine interest, regardless of the tactical advantage a surprise strike might otherwise offer. He had found that justification, on every occasion he encountered it, difficult to take entirely at face value. No power he had ever studied, across 3 decades of service, willingly surrendered the tactical advantage of surprise for the sake of a stated principle. It offended his own carefully cultivated professional instincts to imagine one might. The Kesh Deep Range Consortium, which Thane commanded a defense contingent for, had spent the better part of a decade locked in a slow, grinding resource dispute with a human survey operation along a contested stretch of the Vessic Reach, territory neither side held clear legal title to, and neither side had shown much interest in resolving through formal arbitration. The dispute had remained, for most of that decade, a matter of competing survey claims and occasional diplomatic friction, nothing approaching open hostility. What changed, in the months leading up to the encounter that would end Thane's career and considerably more besides, was a shift in the consortium's own internal politics. A newly ascendant faction within the ruling council, eager to project strength after a string of embarrassing trade concessions elsewhere, and looking for an opportunity to demonstrate the consortium's resolve against a target they judged, based on considerable internal debate, to be safely provocable. Thane had not initiated that political calculation, but he had, when the order eventually reached him, executed it without the reservations he might once have voiced earlier in his career, driven by a mixture of professional obligation and a private, long-simmering skepticism about human military capability that he had never fully examined. "Close on the survey vessel," he ordered, watching the modest human research ship on his tactical display, alone in the disputed sector, unescorted, exactly the kind of isolated target his superiors had identified as ideal for the demonstration the ruling council wanted. "Bring weapons to firing readiness. I want them to understand, clearly, that this sector's disputed status ends today, in the consortium's favor." His weapons officer, a considerably younger man named Dressencore who had joined Thane's command only the previous year, hesitated before executing the order. Captain, that vessel is registered as an unarmed survey ship. If we lock weapons against it, standard human protocol. I am aware of the protocol, Lieutenant, Thane said, with the particular weary condescension he reserved for officers he considered insufficiently seasoned. It is theater. I have studied this policy for years. No power broadcasts its intentions to an enemy and then follows through exactly as announced. It is a bluff dressed up as principle. Lock weapons. Kor executed the order, though Thane noted, with a flicker of irritation he did not bother to voice. The young officer's continued visible discomfort as the weapons array cycled through its charging sequence. He found himself watching Kor's evident unease, recalling his own early years of service, decades earlier, when he too had carried a similar, unexamined caution toward unfamiliar adversaries, a caution he had since come to regard as a natural but ultimately correctable feature of inexperience, rather than any genuine tactical insight. You will find, Lieutenant, Thane said, not unkindly, as the weapons systems completed their charge cycle, that the greatest danger any officer faces is not an enemy's actual capability, but his own willingness to be intimidated by an enemy's reputation rather than its demonstrated conduct. I have studied this species for years. I have found nothing in their documented engagement history that suggests they possess either the capability or the resolve their broadcast policy implies. Watch closely. This will prove instructive. The broadcast arrived 11 seconds after Thane's own weapons lock registered against the human survey vessel, transmitted across every open frequency in the sector with a flat, unhurried clarity that Thane, despite his considerable skepticism, found himself listening to with an attention he had not expected to give it. Human warship locked on. Nothing more followed. No demand for him to stand down. No explanation, no further elaboration, no visible change in the survey vessel's own posture or trajectory. Sensor sweep, Thane ordered, his earlier confidence beginning, almost imperceptibly, to fray at the edges. I want to know if there's an actual warship in this sector, or if that broadcast is exactly the empty theater I've always assessed it to be. The sweep returned nothing. No warship signature, no additional contact anywhere within his fleet's considerable sensor range, nothing beyond the same modest, unarmed survey vessel his own weapons remained locked against. Nothing on sensors, Captain, his tactical officer confirmed. Whatever broadcast that message, it isn't visible to us. Thane allowed himself a small, satisfied exhale, the tension that had briefly gripped him easing into something closer to vindication. As I suspected, theater precisely as I assessed it. There is no warship, Lieutenant. There is a frightened survey crew and an empty threat, broadcast in the hope that we lack the resolve to call their bluff. We do not lack that resolve. Proceed with the strike. Kor hesitated once more, his voice carrying a note of genuine, unmasked unease that Thane found himself, in the moment, too committed to his own assessment to properly weigh. Captain, with respect, the absence of a visible warship signature isn't the same thing as the absence of a warship. Human stealth systems have advanced considerably since our last verified engagement data. I would recommend. Your recommendation is noted, Lieutenant, Thane said. Proceed with the strike. What Captain Thane's sensors had failed to detect in the 11 seconds between his own weapons lock and the broadcast that followed it was the human destroyer Meridian's watch holding position at extreme sensor range, cloaked beneath a layered stealth configuration that Imperial and Consortium intelligence alike had, until this exact moment, significantly underestimated the sophistication of. Commander Amara Osei had been shadowing the survey vessel's patrol route for 6 days, a standing escort assignment that had, until this encounter, produced nothing more eventful than routine sensor logging and the occasional minor course correction. She had watched the Consortium fleet's approach with the particular, unhurried attention of an officer who had run this exact scenario in simulation more times than she cared to count, and had transmitted the standard warning the instant her own systems confirmed the hostile weapons lock, exactly as doctrine required, giving the Consortium captain the same opportunity every target of a human weapons lock was given, the chance to disengage before anything further happened. They're not disengaging, Commander, her tactical officer reported, watching the Consortium fleet's own weapons systems complete their charging sequence rather than power down. Looks like they're proceeding with the strike. Osei felt no particular satisfaction in that development, only the familiar, practical resignation of watching a warning go unheeded exactly as often as her training had prepared her to expect. She had served aboard the Meridian's watch for 4 years, escorting survey and diplomatic vessels along contested frontiers where the broadcast policy's real value became clearest, and had, in that time, watched the warning succeed in defusing tension considerably more often than official statistics circulating through foreign militaries tended to acknowledge. It was, in her own professional experience, a policy that worked precisely as intended in the overwhelming majority of encounters, precisely because most commanders, unlike the one now bearing down on an unarmed survey vessel, took the warning at face value rather than dismissing it as theater. She felt, watching the consortium fleet's weapons complete their charge cycle despite the broadcast, the particular weary sadness of a professional watching an entirely avoidable outcome unfold regardless. Understood. Weapons free. Target the lead vessel's weapons array specifically. I want the strike capability disabled, not the ship destroyed, unless further engagement makes that unavoidable. Confirmed, Commander. Firing solution locked. And Lieutenant, Osei added before the order executed, log the full sequence, from the original broadcast through whatever follows. I suspect this encounter is going to matter considerably beyond today, and I'd rather this consortium have no grounds to dispute what actually happened here. The strike, when it came, arrived with a precision that Thane, in the brief, disoriented moments before his own ship systems began registering catastrophic damage to its primary weapons array, found himself entirely unprepared for. There had been no visible launch, no detectable energy signature preceding the impact, nothing his own sensors had managed to register before the damage reports began flooding his command deck. His ship's main weapons battery, the system he had ordered charged and readied against an unarmed survey vessel scarcely 2 minutes earlier, simply ceased to exist. A single, devastatingly precise strike that had disabled his ship's offensive capability entirely while leaving every other system, remarkably, untouched. Damage report, Thane said, his earlier confidence collapsing into something considerably closer to the fear he had spent 30 years training himself never to display before his own crew. Primary weapons array destroyed, Captain, his tactical officer reported, his voice carrying a barely controlled tremor. Shields, engines, life support, all fully intact. Whatever hit us, it hit exactly what it was aiming for, and nothing else. Thane stared at the tactical display, at the empty space where no warship signature had ever appeared, and understood, with a clarity that arrived considerably too late to matter, exactly how badly he had misjudged the policy he had spent years dismissing as theater. The broadcast crackled across his own bridge speakers once more, the same flat, unhurried voice that had delivered the original warning, carrying now a note that Thane, in his exhausted, humiliated state, recognized not as triumph, but as something closer to simple, professional regret. Consortium vessel. This is Commander Osei, Human Survey Escort Meridian's watch. You were given the standard warning and chose to proceed regardless. Your weapons capability has been disabled. Your crew and remaining systems are untouched. I'd recommend reviewing your own government's assessment of this policy before the next encounter, Captain. The warning was never a bluff. I'm sorry it took this for you to learn that. News of the engagement reached the consortium's ruling council within hours, and the political fallout, considerably more severe than the modest physical damage Thane's ship had actually sustained, arrived with a speed that outpaced even the council's own considerable capacity for damage control. Thane was summoned before a formal inquiry 3 weeks later, standing before a panel of counselors whose faces carried none of the confident, provocative energy that had authorized his original mission. The chamber itself felt considerably smaller than he remembered it from earlier, more triumphant appearances before this same council, its familiar formality now carrying a weight he had never before had cause to feel from the wrong side of the proceedings. Captain Thane, the presiding counselor said, you were briefed extensively on the human broadcast policy prior to this engagement. Your own service record indicates you had studied it personally at some length over the course of several years. I would ask you directly, did you believe, at the moment you ordered the strike to proceed, that the warning was genuine? Thane considered the question for a long moment, aware that his answer would follow him for whatever remained of his career, however long or short that turned out to be. I did not, counselor. I had assessed, based on years of study, that the policy represented diplomatic theater rather than genuine operational doctrine. I was wrong. I proceeded on that assessment despite a direct warning from my own weapons officer that the absence of a visible sensor signature did not guarantee the absence of an actual threat. I take full responsibility for that misjudgment. Your misjudgment, the counselor said, has cost this consortium considerable diplomatic standing across the region, at a moment when this council's own political faction had hoped to demonstrate strength rather than embarrassment. I would ask you, Captain, plainly, what would you have this council learn from your error, beyond the obvious tactical lesson regarding human stealth capability? A second counselor, older and considerably less openly hostile than the presiding officer, leaned forward before Thane could answer. I would add a further question, Captain, if the panel permits it. Your weapons officer raised a direct, explicit objection prior to the strike. You overruled him. I would ask whether you believe, in hindsight, that his objection was grounded in genuine tactical insight or simple inexperience, as you apparently characterized it to him at the time. Thane considered the question with the particular, uncomfortable honesty of a man who had spent 3 weeks since the engagement turning over every decision he had made in the moments leading up to it. I believe, Counselor, that Lieutenant Corps' objection was grounded in considerably more genuine tactical insight than I credited it with at the time. I mistook his caution for inexperience because it did not match my own assessment, built across 30 years of service, and I allowed that seniority to substitute for genuine reconsideration of the evidence in front of me. I would ask this council to note, for whatever it is worth in these proceedings, that Lieutenant Corps' judgment on that day was considerably sounder than my own. The presiding counselor made a note of that, her expression unreadable, before continuing. I would ask you, Captain, plainly, what would you have this council learn from your error, beyond the obvious tactical lesson regarding human stealth capability? Thane was quiet for a moment, thinking of Corps' hesitation, of Osei's flat, regretful voice delivering a warning he had dismissed without proper consideration, of 30 years spent building a professional confidence that had, in the span of a single encounter, proven catastrophically unfounded. I would have this council learn, Counselor, he finally said, that a species choosing transparency is not the same as a species choosing hesitation. I mistook their warning for weakness, because I could not conceive of a power genuinely willing to announce its intentions before acting on them. I was wrong, and I believe every officer in this consortium service would benefit from understanding exactly how wrong I was, before any of them make the same mistake I did. 2 years later, the Kesh Deep Range Consortium issued a formal, standing directive to every officer under its command. Any confirmed human weapons lock broadcast was to be treated, without exception, as an accurate statement of imminent, capable action, regardless of whether accompanying sensor data confirmed the threat independently. The directive carried, in its opening preamble, a brief citation of the incident that had prompted its adoption, Thane's name included, at his own request, submitted during the same formal inquiry that had ended his active command career and reassigned him, in its aftermath, to a considerably quieter role training junior officers in exactly the lesson his own experience had taught him at such personal cost. He delivered that lesson, in the years that followed, to every new class of officers passing through his instruction, always with the same opening line, delivered in the same flat, unhurried tone he had once mistaken, in a moment of catastrophic misjudgment, for an empty threat. There is a warning some of you will eventually hear, if your careers take you anywhere near contested human territory, he told them, at the start of every course. It will arrive without ceremony, without threat, without any of the theatrical weight your instincts might expect from a genuine ultimatum. It will simply state a fact once, and then wait to see what you do with it. I would ask each of you to remember, when that moment comes, that I once believed transparency and hesitation were the same thing. I was given every opportunity to reconsider that belief before it cost me everything my career had built. I am asking you now to learn that lesson from my mistake, rather than from your own. One of his students, a sharp, considerably younger officer named Ren Adebayo, who had shown, across her early coursework, the particular careful skepticism Thane had come to value most in the years since his own catastrophic misjudgment, raised a hand near the end of one such session, several years into his teaching career. "Instructor," she said, "may I ask something the record doesn't cover? Did you ever have the opportunity to speak with Commander Osei again, after the formal inquiry concluded. Thane considered the question for a moment, surprised, not for the first time, by how directly his students had come to ask him things he suspected earlier generations of officers would have considered improper to raise. I did, as it happens. I requested a private correspondence with her some months after my reassignment, largely out of a need to understand, more fully than the formal record allowed, exactly what had passed through her own thinking during the engagement. She was, I will say, considerably more gracious in that exchange than I believe I deserved. What did she tell you? Thane allowed himself a small, rueful smile, remembering the particular unadorned honesty of Osei's reply, received some 8 years earlier now, and reread on more occasions than he cared to admit since. She told me that she took no satisfaction in what happened, and that she hoped sincerely that my career survived it in some useful form, because a lesson learned that thoroughly was worth considerably more, to her mind, than a lesson never tested at all. I have tried, in the years since, to make certain her hope was not misplaced. Do you think it was? Adebayo asked. Thane looked out over the assembled class, considerably more attentive, he thought, than he himself had ever been at their age, considerably more willing to weigh a warning honestly rather than dismiss it out of accumulated professional pride. I think, Lieutenant Adebayo, that the answer to your question depends entirely on what each of you does the next time a warning like that one reaches your own bridge. I have done what I can to make certain you understand its weight. The rest, I'm afraid, remains yours to determine. Nd.